On Christmas Day, my son locked the door and said, "You're no longer part of our family, get out." I saw his wife laughing behind his back, but instead of getting angry, I just nodded, got in my car, and made one phone call. 5 minutes later, all the guests got up from the table and left, leaving them in an empty house. It was a betrayal that demanded justice, and I provided it by turning everything upside down. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Dad, why can't you be like Harrison? He's a real man with real money. Those words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I froze on the threshold of the living room staring at my son Blake, who was adjusting his expensive Omega Speedmaster, a watch that probably cost more than 3 months of my pension. His custom-tailored Tom Ford jacket hung perfectly on his shoulders, every stitch screaming the kind of success I'd never achieved. Everything about him radiated wealth I could never have dreamed of possessing. "What did you just say to me?" My voice came out as barely a whisper, weaker than I wanted it to be. Blake rolled his eyes with that same dismissive gesture he'd perfected as a teenager when I'd asked him to clean his room or finish his homework. But now, at 32, that gesture carried the crushing weight of adult cruelty, the kind that leaves permanent scars. "You heard me perfectly, old man." He straightened his silk Hermes tie with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to emphasize the distance between us. "Harrison Whitfield has built a goddamn empire. Look at this place." He gestured dismissively at my modest living room, the same room where I'd spent countless evenings helping him with algebra homework, reading him bedtime stories, teaching him how to tie his shoes. The worn but clean leather couch where we'd watched Sunday football games together for 20 years suddenly looked shabby through his critical eyes. The family photos on the mantelpiece documenting decades of birthday parties, little league games, and graduation ceremonies seemed to mock the chasm that had opened between us. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. "These hands," I held up my calloused, weathered palms, "paid for every single semester of your college education, every textbook, every meal plan, every spring break trip you took with your fraternity brothers." Blake's laugh was sharp and cutting, like broken glass scraping against concrete. "A college education that barely got me anywhere until I married Sienna. She's the one who opened doors for me, introduced me to real opportunities, real connections." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "And you? You've only held me back with your blue-collar mentality." My hands began to shake as I gripped the doorframe, trying to steady myself against the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. 43 years of backbreaking labor, missed family dinners, working through Christmas mornings and birthdays, all of it suddenly reduced to holding him back. "I made everything out of myself for you, Blake. I gave you everything I had, everything I could possibly give. And what do I have to show for it?" His voice rose with theatrical disgust, loud enough for any neighbors to hear through the thin walls. "A father who lives in a house that screams construction worker to everyone who visits. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is when Sienna's friends ask about my family background?" He began pacing my small living room like a prosecutor building his case. "Harrison owns half of downtown Portland's commercial district. He's got properties in Seattle, San Francisco, even some high-rises in Manhattan. His wine collection alone is worth more than this entire neighborhood." Blake stopped directly in front of me, his expensive cologne creating an invisible barrier between us. "And what do you own, Dad?" "A tool shed full of hammers and a 20-year-old pickup truck." Something fundamental cracked inside my chest, not just my heart, but something deeper. The careful restraint I'd maintained through 37 years of parenthood finally shattered like tempered glass under too much pressure. "Get out." I pointed toward the front door with a finger that trembled with rage and heartbreak. "Right now, get out of my house." Blake's smile was cold and satisfied, like a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. "Oh, please don't play the wounded father card now. We both know I've outgrown this place years ago." He took measured steps toward the door, each footfall echoing with disdain. "Maybe it's finally time you accepted that some people are meant for bigger things than this small-minded working-class existence." The front door slammed with such force that every framed photo on my mantelpiece shook violently. Several fell over, including the one of Blake's high school graduation. The day I'd worked an 18-hour shift and then driven straight to the ceremony in my stained work clothes, because nothing would have kept me from seeing my son walk across that stage. I stood alone in the sudden, deafening silence, trying to process what had just happened. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I'd driven to every baseball practice and band concert, the young man I'd been so proud of when he graduated with honors, had just dismissed 4 decades of my life as not only worthless, but actively harmful to his success. Outside, I heard metallic scraping sounds echoing through the December evening, footsteps crunching on gravel, something heavy being dragged across concrete. But I was too emotionally devastated to investigate, too broken to care about anything happening beyond these walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in on me. I moved through my evening routine like a ghost haunting his own life, hanging my work shirt in the closet with the same mechanical precision I'd practiced for decades. My reflection in the bedroom mirror revealed a 73-year-old man who suddenly looked every single one of those years, plus a few more that grief had added in the span of a single conversation. Blake's words echoed with every movement I made. A real man with real money. As I brushed my teeth, I couldn't escape the memory of 8-year-old Blake proudly showing his elementary school friends the miniature toolbox I'd given him for Christmas. "My dad builds everything," he had announced with pure, unfiltered excitement. "Skyscrapers and bridges and houses where families live." When exactly had that childhood pride transformed into adult shame? When had my calloused hands become symbols of embarrassment instead of honest work? I remembered that brutal winter night when I worked until 3 in the morning on the Henderson office complex project, then drove straight to Blake's high school graduation ceremony. I arrived in coffee-stained work clothes with concrete dust under my fingernails, but I made it. I wouldn't have missed it for anything in the world. Blake had hugged me afterward, whispering, "Thanks for always being there for me, Dad. I know how hard you work to give me opportunities." Those same hands he just rejected as symbols of mediocrity had built the foundation for his entire future. Paying for his college education had meant working 18-hour days for 3 straight years. I missed family dinners, sacrificed weekends with friends, gave up vacations and hobbies. Every overtime payment, every holiday bonus, every spare dollar went directly into his education fund. "I want you to have the opportunities I never had," I told him during those grueling years when exhaustion was my constant companion. He had seemed grateful then, understanding the magnitude of the sacrifice. But everything changed after his first visit to Harrison Whitfield's estate. I could still picture that October evening when he returned from dinner at Sienna's family home, his eyes burning with a hunger I'd never seen before. It was the look of someone who had tasted a different kind of life and found his own existence lacking. "Dad, you should see Harrison's house," he had said, collapsing onto my modest couch with the weight of new understanding. "It's like something from Architectural Digest. A wine cellar with bottles from the 1800s, marble floors imported from Italy, paintings that belong in museums. His garage has 7 cars, including a vintage Ferrari that's worth more than our entire neighborhood." His voice had carried awe, but underneath it was something darker, a seed of resentment that would grow into the monster that had just destroyed our relationship. The comparisons began innocently enough. "Harrison says investment portfolios are more reliable than pension plans." Then they became bolder. Maybe I should have studied business instead of engineering, focused on building wealth instead of just building things. Finally came the questioning looks when he visited my modest home, as if he were seeing it through new, critical eyes, Harrison's eyes. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Dinner invitations dwindled to obligatory holiday appearances. "Sorry, Dad, Sienna's family has an event," became his standard excuse, delivered with increasing comfort as the months passed. I had tried not to notice how his voice changed when he spoke about Harrison. Reverent, enthusiastic, the way he used to talk about me when he was proud to be my son. Last Christmas he'd arrived an hour late with expensive gifts that felt more like tax write-offs than expressions of love. "Harrison is teaching me about charitable deductions," he said as he unwrapped the watch I'd been saving for months to buy him. "Strategic philanthropy can be very beneficial for tax purposes." Even my gifts had become opportunities for him to demonstrate his new sophistication, his distance from the simple man who had raised him. I had watched my son transform from a boy who was proud of his working-class father into a man who was ashamed of his own origins. Each visit revealed new changes: designer clothes, a practiced way of discussing stock options and market volatility, casual mentions of exclusive country clubs, and business lunches with important connections. Today's confrontation hadn't been a sudden explosion of cruelty. It was the inevitable conclusion of years of growing distance, the final severing of bonds that had been fraying since the day Blake discovered there was a world where men were measured by their portfolios rather than their character. Harrison Whitfield hadn't just gained a son-in-law when Blake married Sienna. He had stolen my son, not through malice, but through the simple fact of existing in a world where my sacrifices seemed insignificant compared to his inherited wealth. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling I'd painted myself 15 years ago, I tried to remember the last time Blake had asked about my health, my happiness, or even my day. The silence stretched back months, maybe years. When had I become irrelevant to the boy around whom I'd built my entire existence? This house, which Blake now considered shameful, had been his sanctuary during every childhood crisis. These walls had witnessed his first steps, heard his first words, sheltered him through nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. Now they represented everything he wanted to escape from. Sleep finally found me around midnight, but even in my dreams I couldn't escape the echo of his words. Some people are meant for bigger things. Apparently, I wasn't one of them. And neither, in his mind, was the man who had sacrificed everything to make those bigger things possible. Morning light seeped through my bedroom curtains like an unwelcome intruder, harsh and unforgiving against eyes that had barely closed all night. My joints protested as I rolled out of bed, every movement a reminder that 73 years had exacted their toll, and yesterday's emotional beating had aged me even more. The digital clock read 8:47 a.m., later than I'd slept in months, but yesterday's confrontation had drained me more completely than any physical labor ever had. The house felt different in the morning light, smaller somehow, as if Blake's rejection had actually changed the dimensions of the space where I'd raised him. I shuffled to the bathroom, deliberately avoiding my reflection in the mirror. Coffee called to me from the kitchen, promising the caffeine I needed to face whatever this new reality would bring. A reality where my son saw me as nothing more than an embarrassment to be discarded. December snow had fallen overnight, covering my working-class neighborhood in pristine white that made everything appear cleaner and more hopeful than it really was. The familiar ritual of brewing coffee and retrieving the morning paper from the front porch usually grounded me, giving structure to retirement days that sometimes felt endless and purposeless. But as I stepped outside into the crisp Colorado air, I immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. My mailbox, a simple black metal unit I'd installed 15 years ago, with the same careful precision I brought to all my projects, was destroyed. Not damaged by weather or time, but deliberately, systematically destroyed. Someone had taken a baseball bat or crowbar to it, bending the metal with malicious intent, leaving the door hanging at an unnatural angle like a broken jaw. Fresh scratches scarred the surface in patterns that spoke of sustained, purposeful violence. The supporting post was loose, tilting the entire structure toward the street at an angle that screamed violation. This wasn't random teenage vandalism. This was personal, calculated, meant to send a message. The memory of last night's metallic scraping sounds suddenly made perfect sense. While I was inside processing Blake's betrayal, someone had been outside, extending that betrayal into physical destruction of my property. I knelt down to examine the base, my knees protesting the movement, but my engineering mind demanding details. Boot prints in the fresh snow around the mailbox, size 11 or 12, adult prints with a distinctive tread pattern I didn't recognize. The cold bit through my robe as I tried to reconstruct the timeline of last night's events. As I walked back toward the house with the newspaper clutched under my arm, an unfamiliar sensation crawled up my spine like ice water, uneasiness mixed with growing anger. In 43 years of living in this neighborhood, I'd never been targeted for property damage. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Back in my warm kitchen, I poured coffee into my favorite mug, a Father's Day gift from Blake when he was 12, now carrying bitter irony, and spread the newspaper across the table. The familiar comfort of morning routine felt foreign after yesterday's upheaval. Words blurred as my concentration fractured between the damaged mailbox and Blake's cruel dismissal. I thought about calling the police, then dismissed the idea. What would I tell them? "Officer, my mailbox was vandalized the same night my son told me I was a worthless embarrassment to his success." They'd think I was a paranoid old man making connections where none existed. The coffee went cold as I stared at headlines I couldn't process. Sports scores, weather forecasts, local political developments. Nothing penetrated the fog of unease that had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The phone's shrill ring cut through my dark thoughts. I stared at it for 3 rings, half expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. The last voice I expected to hear was Blake's. "Dad, it's me." His tone carried an artificial sweetness that immediately set off every alarm in my head, completely different from yesterday's brutal honesty. "Blake?" I kept my voice carefully neutral, not knowing where this conversation was headed. "Listen, I've been awake all night thinking about what happened yesterday." The words flowed too smoothly, too practiced, like dialogue he'd rehearsed multiple times. I completely lost my temper and said things I didn't mean. I'm truly, deeply sorry. After 37 years of parenting, I knew when Blake was lying. His childhood tells were still there. The slight pause before key words, the overly formal language he used when trying to manipulate a situation. This performance was masterful, but it was still a performance. "You seemed pretty clear about your feelings yesterday," I replied, testing the waters. No, that's exactly the problem. I wasn't thinking clearly at all." His laugh sounded hollow like an echo in an empty room. "You know how stressful things have been with work, with money pressures, with Sienna's family expectations. You understand how demanding Harrison can be." Something cold and predatory settled in my stomach. The Blake of yesterday had been brutal but honest in his cruelty. This version felt dangerous precisely because of his deception. "Actually," he continued, his voice brightening with false enthusiasm, "that's exactly why I'm calling. Sienna and I would love to invite you to Christmas dinner tomorrow evening at our house. Nothing too fancy, just Harrison, some of his business partners, and a few other family members. Christmas dinner. After yesterday's destruction, after telling me I was no longer family, after 40 years of sacrifices dismissed as embarrassments, now he wanted me at dinner with Harrison's wealthy friends." "Dinner's at 6, Blake continued. "Sienna's making her famous prime rib. Oh, and Dad, maybe wear that nice navy suit you had for Mom's funeral. First impressions matter with Harrison's colleagues." I should have said no. Every instinct screamed danger, but a desperate, pathetic part of me wanted to believe this was genuine remorse. Maybe seeing me broken had awakened some vestige of the son who once loved me. I suppose I could come." "Fantastic. Oh, and Dad?" His voice became distant, as if he'd forgotten to cover the phone properly. He really believed it. Blake's laugh was sharp and cruel, barely muffled by his attempt to cover the receiver. "Did you hear that pathetic hope in his voice when he accepted?" "You're terrible," came Sienna's voice, amused rather than disapproving. "Although I have to admit, this is going to be entertaining. Daddy will love seeing the contrast. His successful business empire against your construction worker father. The difference will be illuminating." "Don't forget the bigger picture," Sienna added, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Daddy needs to see how much we've evolved beyond your working-class background. This dinner practically guarantees his full support for our inheritance and Blake's position in the company." "Exactly. By the end of the evening, Joseph will look so pathetic next to Harrison's sophisticated friends that Daddy will see how far we've risen above our humble origins. It'll cement our position as his true heirs. My hand was shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. The intricate cruelty of their plan hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't about reconciliation or family healing. It was about using me as a prop in their elaborate manipulation of Harrison Whitfield. I carefully placed the phone back in its cradle, my entire body trembling with a combination of rage and heartbreak. They had orchestrated everything: the fake apology, the dinner invitation, probably even the mailbox destruction to psychologically soften me up for their scheme. My son hadn't just rejected me. He had decided to weaponize my love for him, to turn my willingness to forgive into ammunition for their inheritance grab. They planned to parade me in front of Harrison's wealthy associates as living proof of how far they'd evolved beyond their embarrassing origins. The kitchen suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls pressing in as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. This wasn't teenage rebellion or even adult disappointment. This was calculated emotional terrorism, designed to destroy what little dignity I had left, while advancing their financial interests. But as I sat there in the suffocating silence, something else began to grow in my chest. Not the devastating sadness of yesterday, but something harder, more focused. The cold anger of a man who had finally seen the true nature of his enemies. If Blake and Sienna wanted to play games with my emotions, if they thought they could use me as entertainment for Harrison's amusement while securing their inheritance, they were about to discover that this old construction worker still had a few blueprints left in him. And sometimes the most effective structures are the ones designed to bring everything else crashing down. My hands stopped shaking as a different kind of clarity settled over me. The same focused concentration I'd once brought to solving complex structural problems on construction sites. For 43 years, I'd built things designed to last, to withstand pressure, to serve their intended purpose with maximum efficiency. Now I needed to build something else entirely: justice. I walked to my desk drawer, where I kept important documents and business cards, moving with the deliberate precision of a man who had just found his purpose. Harrison Whitfield had given me his business card at Blake's birthday party 8 months ago, a gesture of respect between in-laws that I'd appreciated at the time. "Call me any time, Joseph," he'd said with genuine warmth, shaking my calloused hand without the slightest trace of condescension. "We should get to know each other better. Any man who raised a son like Blake deserves my respect." The irony of those words now felt like a blade twisting in an old wound. Harrison's business card was exactly where I'd filed it, between insurance documents and warranty information, part of the precise organization system that had served me well through decades of managing complex construction projects. The cardstock was expensive, heavy paper that spoke of success earned rather than inherited. Whitfield Commercial Development, Harrison Whitfield, CEO. Below that, his direct office number and personal cell phone. I settled into my reading chair with a clear view of both the front window and the kitchen clock. The strategy required careful timing and surgical precision. I needed to reach Harrison before Blake and Sienna could implement their manipulation scheme, but my approach had to be perfect, factual, respectful, and impossible to dismiss as the bitter complaints of a rejected father. After 3 decades of project management, I understood that the key to solving any complex problem was breaking it down into manageable components. The facts. Blake and Sienna were planning to use tomorrow's dinner to humiliate me in front of Harrison's business associates, demonstrating their superiority over their working-class origins to secure their inheritance and Blake's position in the company. The evidence. I had accidentally overheard their conversation, revealing their true motivations and the calculated cruelty of their plan. The stakes. Harrison was being manipulated into participating in emotional abuse of an elderly family member without his knowledge or consent. The solution. Present Harrison with the truth and let him decide how to handle the betrayal. I needed to appeal to Harrison's sense of fairness while acknowledging my own emotional investment in the situation. The approach had to balance urgency with diplomacy, honesty with restraint. The numbers felt familiar under my fingertips as I dialed Harrison's direct office line. Professional muscle memory from decades of important business calls, contract negotiations, emergency consultations. Each digit deliberate, purposeful, irreversible. The phone rang twice before Harrison's familiar voice answered, crisp and professional, but warm. Harrison Whitfield. Harrison, this is Joseph Taylor. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Joseph, not at all. It's good to hear from you. How are you doing? His genuine warmth made what I had to do even more difficult, but also more necessary. I'm afraid I need to discuss something rather delicate with you, something concerning tomorrow's dinner. I'm listening. This morning I accidentally overheard a conversation between Blake and Sienna that I think you need to know about. They were discussing their real motivations for inviting me to dinner tomorrow. I took a deep breath and told him everything. Their plan to humiliate me in front of his business partners. Their scheme to use the contrast between his wealth and my working-class background to demonstrate how far they'd evolved. Their assumption that this performance would secure their inheritance and Blake's future in the company. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice carried the cold fury of a man who had just discovered he was being played. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard? Unfortunately, yes. They made it clear that they see tomorrow's dinner as a strategic opportunity to showcase their superiority while cementing their position as your heirs. Joseph, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. It takes courage to make a call like this, especially given the family dynamics involved. I didn't want you to be used as an unwitting participant in their scheme. You deserve to know what they're really planning. Indeed, I do. And Joseph, I want you to know that their behavior reflects absolutely nothing about your character or worth. What they're planning is despicable. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes as we discussed the full scope of their manipulation. Harrison's business mind was already working, analyzing angles and consequences with the same strategic thinking that had built his commercial empire. I have a proposal, Harrison said finally. What if we turn their own plan against them? Let them proceed with their dinner party, but with a few modifications to the guest list and the evening's trajectory. As he outlined his counter-strategy, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Blake's betrayal began. Hope. Not just for revenge, but for justice. The kind that comes when manipulators discover they've underestimated their intended victims. Are you willing to participate in this, Joseph? It will require you to endure their initial cruelty, but I guarantee you it will be the last time they're in a position to hurt anyone. Harrison, I've spent 43 years building things designed to last. I think it's time I helped tear down something that deserves to fall. Then we have an understanding. Tomorrow night should be very educational for everyone involved. After ending the call, I sat in my chair for several minutes, feeling a transformation taking place within me. The broken, defeated father from yesterday was gone, replaced by something harder and more focused. A man who had finally found a worthy use for decades of accumulated wisdom and determination. Blake and Sienna had made two critical mistakes. They had underestimated both me and Harrison, assuming we would be passive participants in their scheme. Tomorrow night, they would discover that some structures, when properly engineered, can bring down entire buildings, and sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. December 24th dawned gray and cold, with fresh snow beginning to fall on Portland's suburbs like a benediction, or perhaps a shroud for what was about to unfold. I woke earlier than usual, my mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been since before Blake's betrayal. Today would be the day that justice finally caught up with manipulation. The morning routine felt different now that I had purpose beyond mere survival. Coffee tasted stronger, the newspaper headlines seemed clearer. Even the sight of my damaged mailbox filled me with satisfaction rather than violation. It was evidence, proof of the kind of people Blake and Sienna had become, the kind who would destroy property to psychologically soften their victims. Harrison had called the previous evening to finalize our strategy. His voice carried the same controlled intensity I remembered from successful business leaders, men who built empires by staying 3 steps ahead of their competition. Joseph, I've spent the day making some calls, doing some research into Blake's behavior at the company. What I've discovered is illuminating. He's been positioning himself as my successor for months, making promises to clients about future contracts, even suggesting to some of our partners that his inheritance of the company is a foregone conclusion. Meanwhile, he's been systematically undermining other employees who might pose competition for leadership positions. The revelation hadn't surprised me. Blake's transformation from grateful son to calculating manipulator had been gradual, but thorough. There's more, Harrison had continued. I had my accountant review his expense reports from the past 6 months. Blake's been charging personal purchases to the company. Restaurants, clothing, even that Omega watch he's been wearing. He's essentially been stealing from me while positioning himself as my heir. Now, as I prepared for the evening that would determine all our futures, I felt the calm focus that came with knowing I was on the right side of justice. Blake and Sienna had chosen their path when they decided that manipulation and cruelty were acceptable tools for advancement. Tonight they would face the consequences of those choices. I spent the day in careful preparation. The navy suit Harrison had requested was cleaned and pressed. More importantly, I spent hours cooking, preparing a complete Christmas dinner that would serve 8 people comfortably. Prime rib roast, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, freshly baked dinner rolls, and apple pie made from my late wife's recipe. If Harrison's counterplan worked as intended, we would have guests who deserved a real Christmas celebration, rather than the performance Blake and Sienna had orchestrated. As the prime rib roasted in the oven, filling my modest kitchen with rich, savory aromas, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. Yesterday I was a discarded father, broken and seemingly powerless. Today I was a key participant in a strategy that would reshape multiple lives and deliver justice where it was desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Blake's rejection had actually freed me to become something more dangerous than he'd ever imagined, a man with nothing left to lose and the wisdom to use it effectively. At 4:30 p.m. my phone rang. Harrison's voice was crisp and satisfied. Everything is in place, Joseph. My business partners understand the situation and are prepared to follow my lead. Blake and Sienna have no idea what's coming. And you're certain this is what you want to do? There's no going back once we start this. Harrison's laugh was cold and decisive. Joseph, they made their choice when they decided to use family relationships as tools for financial manipulation. Tonight, they'll learn that some prices are too high to pay. At 5:45 p.m. I drove through the affluent Hillcrest neighborhood where Blake and Sienna had built their shrine to material success. Mercedes and BMWs lined the curved streets like expensive jewelry displayed on black velvet. Christmas lights twinkled from mansions that could house entire families, each home a testament to the kind of wealth I'd never imagined, let alone aspired to. Blake's house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, its limestone facade illuminated by strategically placed spotlights that made it glow like a movie set. Harrison's black Bentley dominated the circular driveway, surrounded by other luxury vehicles that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. The scene looked like something from Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, all surface glamour with carefully hidden rot beneath. I parked my modest Honda Civic next to a gleaming Porsche 911, the contrast almost comical. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows I could see silhouettes moving around what appeared to be a dining room, designed by professional decorators. Harrison's business associates were already there, no doubt preparing for what they believed would be an elegant holiday dinner. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of their host's carefully constructed facades. Checking my appearance in the rearview mirror, I straightened my tie and adjusted my jacket. The same navy suit I'd worn to my wife's funeral looked respectable enough, though it would appear modest next to the designer clothing inside. That was exactly what Blake and Sienna were counting on, the visual contrast that would make their evolution so apparent to Harrison's wealthy friends. But as I walked up the pristine stone pathway toward the front door, My steps were confident, my breathing steady. Let them have their moment of anticipated triumph. Justice has a way of arriving when it's least expected, and tonight it would arrive with devastating precision. Before I could reach for the doorbell, the front door opened with theatrical timing. Blake stood silhouetted against the golden light pouring from the foyer, his expensive Armani suit immaculate, his expression bearing the cruel satisfaction I'd heard in his voice during yesterday's overheard conversation. Well, well, look who decided to grace us with his presence. His voice was pitched loud enough for the guests inside to hear, setting the stage for the public humiliation he'd planned. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to show up. Behind him appeared Sienna, perfectly positioned like a supporting actress making her entrance on cue. Her black Versace cocktail dress probably cost more than my monthly pension, and her smile had the sharp edge of anticipated entertainment. Diamond earrings that caught and reflected the foyer light completed her costume for tonight's performance. "Oh, this is absolutely precious," she said with barely contained glee. "He actually came. Harrison, darling, come see who's here." Harrison appeared behind them, but something in his expression was different from what Blake and Sienna expected. Instead of the polite tolerance they anticipated, his face showed something harder, more evaluative. He was already analyzing the situation with the sharp intelligence that had built his business empire. "Joseph," Harrison said with surprising warmth, stepping forward to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight." Blake's confident smile flickered with momentary confusion. This wasn't the script he'd written, where Harrison would politely tolerate the working-class father while noting the obvious contrast with his own sophisticated success. "Dad," Blake said, his voice carrying forced joviality that didn't reach his eyes. Come in. Everyone's eager to meet you." But as I stepped into the marble-floored foyer, I noticed something that made Blake and Sienna's expression shift from confidence to puzzlement. Harrison's business associates, the wealthy professionals who were supposed to provide the audience for my humiliation, were looking at me with respectful interest rather than condescending pity. "Joseph Taylor," Harrison announced to the assembled group, "is one of the finest engineers and project managers in Portland's construction industry. He built half the commercial buildings in the downtown district, including the Morrison Tower and the Riverside Medical Complex." One of the associates, a distinguished man in his 60s, stepped forward with genuine enthusiasm. "Joseph Taylor, I should have recognized the name immediately. Your work on the Morrison Tower was absolutely brilliant. That foundation design in such challenging soil conditions was engineering poetry." Blake's face went pale as another guest joined the conversation. "The Riverside Medical Complex too? My God, that's one of the most structurally sound buildings in the city. You saved the developers millions with that innovative beam placement design." I didn't realize you knew about Dad's work," Blake stammered, his carefully planned evening already veering off script. "Know about it?" Harrison's voice carried a note of surprise that seemed genuine but was actually perfectly calculated. "Joseph, you never mentioned that you were the lead engineer on some of Portland's most iconic buildings. Blake, you should be incredibly proud of your father's legacy." Sienna stepped forward, trying to salvage their plan with desperate charm. "Oh, Daddy, we are proud, of course. But tonight is about celebrating our family as it is now, our future together, not dwelling on the past." "The past?" Harrison repeated, his tone sharpening just enough for everyone to notice. "Sienna, are you suggesting that Joseph's decades of building Portland's skyline should be forgotten?" The room fell silent except for the soft Christmas music playing in the background. Blake and Sienna had walked directly into the trap that Harrison and I had constructed for them. In their eagerness to diminish my accomplishments, they had revealed their true attitude toward the man who had actually built something lasting and meaningful. "That's not what we meant," Blake said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. The confident superiority he'd displayed at my front door was evaporating as he realized the evening wasn't proceeding according to his carefully choreographed plan. "What did you mean exactly?" asked one of Harrison's partners, a sharp-eyed woman who had built her own fortune in real estate development. Because it sounds like you're embarrassed by your father's incredible achievements. The elegant dining room that Blake and Sienna had prepared for their triumph suddenly felt like a courtroom where they were both defendants and prosecutors. Except the jury was turning against them with each passing moment. "Perhaps we should move to dinner," Sienna suggested with forced brightness, desperate to regain control of the evening's narrative. "I've prepared Harrison's favorite prime rib, and I'm sure everyone is hungry." But Harrison made no move toward the dining room. Instead, he settled more comfortably into one of their expensive leather armchairs, his posture suggesting a man preparing for a much longer and more significant conversation. "Actually, I think we need to address something first," Harrison said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority that had made him one of Portland's most successful businessmen. "Joseph, I owe you an apology." Blake and Sienna froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to barely concealed panic. "An apology?" I asked, playing my part perfectly. "Yes. I've spent the last 24 hours learning some very disturbing things about how you've been treated by members of your own family." Harrison's gaze swept across Blake and Sienna with surgical precision. "Things that make me question everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me." "Harrison, I don't know what you've heard, but I heard your conversation yesterday morning," Harrison interrupted, his voice cutting through Blake's desperate attempt at damage control like a blade through silk. "The one where you and Sienna discussed using Joseph as a prop for tonight's dinner, planning to humiliate him in front of my associates to demonstrate how far you've evolved beyond your working-class origins." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb sound from the entire house. Even the Christmas music seemed to fade into insignificance against the weight of Harrison's revelation. Sienna's face went white beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Daddy, you don't understand. We weren't—" "I understand perfectly," Harrison continued, his voice now carrying the cold fury of a man who had discovered he'd been systematically betrayed. "I also understand that you've been charging personal expenses to my company for months, Blake. That Omega Speedmaster on your wrist, company funds, this Armani suit, also company funds, the lease on your Porsche, your membership at the country club, even Sienna's jewelry, all paid for with money stolen from my business while you positioned yourself as my heir apparent." Blake's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: denial, panic, anger, and finally desperate calculation. "That's a misunderstanding. Those were legitimate business expenses." "Legitimate?" One of Harrison's associates, a forensic accountant who had been quietly observing the evening's developments, spoke up for the first time. "I've reviewed your expense reports at Harrison's request. You charged a romantic weekend in Napa Valley as a client relations expense, despite the fact that the only people present were you and Sienna." Another associate added, "The country club membership was categorized as networking and professional development, but according to the club's records, you've never brought a single business contact there. You've used it exclusively for personal recreation." "This is ridiculous. We're family. Everything we did was for the good of the company, to maintain the kind of image that reflects well on Harrison's success." "Family?" Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Is that what you call planning to humiliate Joseph in front of my colleagues? Is that what you call stealing from my company while plotting to inherit it?" He stood up slowly, his movement commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Let me tell you what real family looks like, Sienna. Real family doesn't vandalize an elderly man's mailbox to psychologically soften him up for public humiliation." Blake's face went ashen. "How did you know about the mailbox?" "Because unlike you, I actually investigate before I act. Joseph's neighbor has a security camera that captured everything. You, Blake, taking a crowbar to your own father's property at 11:30 p.m. on December 22nd, 40 minutes after you left his house following your cruel rejection." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only had Harrison uncovered their financial theft and emotional manipulation, he had evidence of their property destruction, evidence that could result in criminal charges. "You see," Harrison continued, beginning to pace the room with predatory grace. I built my business by understanding people, by recognizing their true character beneath whatever facade they present. And what I've learned about both of you in the past 24 hours is that you are fundamentally dishonest people who view relationships as tools for exploitation rather than bonds of genuine affection. One of the guests, a woman who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "This is uncomfortable. Perhaps we should leave you to resolve this privately." "No," Harrison said firmly. "I want witnesses for what I'm about to say, because I want there to be no ambiguity about my decisions going forward." He turned to face Blake and Sienna directly, his expression carrying the finality of Judgment Day. "Blake, you are fired from Whitfield Commercial Development, effective immediately. Your access to company resources is revoked, your company credit cards are canceled, and your name is being removed from all current projects. Security will be at your office tomorrow morning to escort you out and collect company property." Blake's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a chair for support, his face gray with shock. "Harrison, please, you can't." "I can and I will. Furthermore, my attorneys will be filing theft charges against you for the misappropriation of company funds. The total amount exceeds $50,000, which makes it a felony." "Daddy, no. You can't do this. We're your family." "And Sienna," Harrison continued, his voice now carrying the weight of paternal disappointment that cut deeper than any business decision, "my will is being rewritten next week. Your inheritance is being reduced to exactly what Blake brought into this marriage, which, as we all now know, is nothing but debt and stolen property." The room fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the consequences became clear. Blake and Sienna hadn't just lost a dinner party or suffered social embarrassment. They had lost everything: Blake's career, their financial security, their future inheritance, and most importantly, their carefully constructed facade of success and respectability. "The bulk of my estate," Harrison continued, "will be going to organizations that understand the value of honest work and genuine character. Joseph, I'd like you to help me identify some worthy construction and engineering scholarship funds." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of vindication, but also the sadness of seeing a family destroy itself through greed and manipulation. "I'd be honored to help, Harrison. There are many young people who could benefit from opportunities to build something meaningful with their lives." Blake made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "This is all his fault." He pointed at me with a trembling finger. "He poisoned your mind against us. He filled you with lies." "Joseph told me the truth," Harrison replied simply. "Something you two seem constitutionally incapable of doing. The lies, the manipulation, the theft, that's all you're doing." The exodus began quietly, but inevitably. Harrison's business associates, having witnessed the complete unraveling of Blake and Sienna's carefully constructed deception, began gathering their coats and purses with the practiced discretion of people accustomed to dramatic business confrontations. "This has been educational," said the forensic accountant, shaking Harrison's hand with genuine respect. "You handled that with remarkable restraint, considering the scope of their betrayal." "Justice doesn't require anger," Harrison replied. "Just clarity and decisive action." One by one, the guests expressed their respect for how the situation had been handled, several mentioning their admiration for my decades of engineering work. The contrast with Blake and Sienna's plan couldn't have been more complete. Instead of being humiliated as the working-class embarrassment, I had been revealed as the accomplished professional and devoted father I had always been. "Wait," Blake called out as the last guest reached the door. "Please don't leave like this. There's been a misunderstanding. We can work this out." But no one stopped. In the harsh social mathematics of Portland's business elite, Blake and Sienna had revealed themselves to be liabilities rather than assets. Their carefully cultivated connections were evaporating as quickly as their stolen wealth. When the door closed behind the final guest, the three of us were left alone in the enormous house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum of shattered ambitions. "How could you do this to us?" Sienna asked through tears, looking at me with something approaching hatred. "We gave you everything," A beautiful daughter-in-law, a successful son, connections to people who matter. You gave me nothing but cruelty and manipulation, I replied quietly. And you took everything that mattered. My son's love, his respect, his basic human decency. Blake slumped into one of his expensive chairs, the fight finally going out of him as the full reality of his situation began to sink in. What are we supposed to do now? How are we supposed to live? The same way millions of honest people live every day, Harrison answered. Through work, integrity, and earned success, rather than manipulation and theft. He moved toward the door, then paused. Blake, you're 32 years old. You have an engineering degree that your father sacrificed everything to provide. You have skills, education, and decades of potential ahead of you. What you don't have anymore is the option to build your future on lies and exploitation. And Sienna? He continued, his voice heavy with paternal sadness. You're my daughter, and I will always love you. But love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or pretending that cruelty and dishonesty are acceptable ways to advance in life. As Harrison and I walked toward the door together, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at the cost of destroying the last remnants of the family I had worked so hard to build and maintain. Joseph, Harrison said as we reached our cars, I want you to know that what happened tonight was necessary, but I take no pleasure in it. Nor do I replied honestly. But some betrayals are so fundamental that they require consequences, no matter how painful those consequences might be. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about building things designed to last. Blake and Sienna tried to build their future on a foundation of deception and exploitation. Structures like that always collapse eventually. As we drove away from the house where Blake and Sienna's dreams had died, I realized that this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. For the first time in months, I felt free from the weight of their manipulation and cruelty. Tomorrow, I would wake up as a man whose worth wasn't determined by his son's approval or disapproval, but by the solid foundation of character and achievement I had built over 7 decades of honest living. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and crystalline air that seemed to wash the world clean of yesterday's ugliness. I woke in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the authentic Christmas decorations and family memories that Blake had once dismissed as embarrassing. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful. The phone rang at 8:30 a.m., and I was surprised to hear Harrison's voice, warm and energetic despite the previous evening's emotional exhaustion. Joseph, I hope you don't mind me calling so early, but I wanted to make you an offer. What kind of offer? I'm hosting a small Christmas dinner today. Just a few close friends and business associates who appreciate authentic values over artificial status. Would you consider joining us? I'd like to introduce you properly to people who would value your friendship. The invitation touched something deep inside me, not the desperate hope I'd felt when Blake called with his manipulative dinner invitation, but genuine appreciation for human kindness freely offered. I'd be honored to join you, Harrison. Excellent. And Joseph, bring your appetite. I've hired the best caterer in Portland, but something tells me it won't compare to the kind of home cooking a man learns after 45 years of marriage. As I prepared for the day, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 48 hours. 2 days ago, I was a broken man whose son had rejected him as an embarrassment. Today, I was a respected professional being welcomed into a circle of people who valued character over wealth, integrity over status. At 11:00 a.m., my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment my heart clenched with the possibility that Blake and Sienna had come to attempt some final manipulation or cruel gesture. Instead, I found a delivery man holding an enormous floral arrangement, winter flowers and evergreen branches arranged with obvious professional skill. The card read, Joseph, thank you for reminding me what real family values look like. With genuine respect and gratitude, Harrison Whitfield. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, the voice was unfamiliar. A professional woman who introduced herself as Rebecca Chen, senior partner at Portland's most prestigious engineering firm. Mr. Taylor, Harrison Whitfield gave me your number. I understand you're recently retired from active construction work, but I wondered if you might be interested in consulting on some of our more challenging structural projects. Your reputation in the industry is exceptional, and frankly, we could use someone with your experience and integrity. The opportunity was unexpected but appealing, a chance to use my skills again to build something meaningful while earning the respect that Blake had tried to convince me I didn't deserve. I'd be very interested in discussing it further. Wonderful. Are you available for lunch next week? I'd like to talk about several projects where your expertise could be invaluable. Harrison's Christmas dinner was everything Blake and Sienna's performance had pretended to be. Elegant but genuine, wealthy but unpretentious, successful but grounded in real accomplishment rather than inherited advantage. The guest list included some of Portland's most accomplished professionals. Doctors who had built free clinics, entrepreneurs who had created thousands of jobs, educators who had transformed struggling schools into centers of excellence. These were people who had earned their success through talent, hard work, and genuine contribution to their community. Joseph, said Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a surgeon who had pioneered new techniques for treating children's heart conditions. Harrison told us about your work on the Morrison Tower. I've always wondered about the engineering challenges of building in Portland soil conditions. For the next hour, I found myself at the center of genuine conversation about structural engineering, construction challenges, and the satisfaction of building things that would last for generations. These weren't polite questions designed to make me feel included. They were the inquiries of intelligent people who recognized expertise when they encountered it. Friends, Harrison said as dinner concluded, I want to share something that happened yesterday that reminded me why character matters more than wealth, why integrity matters more than inheritance. He told them the story, not in a way designed to humiliate Blake and Sienna, but as a lesson in the difference between earned respect and manipulated advantage. The guests listened with the focused attention of successful people who understood that such lessons were valuable regardless of your station in life. Joseph reminded me, Harrison concluded, that real family isn't about blood or money or social status. It's about the people who support you when it matters, who value truth over convenience, who build their lives on solid foundations rather than shifting sand. As the evening wound down, several guests approached me with business cards and invitations to future gatherings. Rebecca Chen mentioned 3 specific projects where my consulting expertise could be valuable. Dr. Rodriguez invited me to tour the Children's Hospital, where several buildings I had helped design were still serving young patients. Most importantly, I realized I had found something I hadn't even known I was missing. A community of people who valued the same things I did, who measured success by contribution rather than accumulation. Driving home through the snow-covered streets of Portland, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. Blake's cruel rejection, which had seemed like the end of my world just days earlier, had actually been the beginning of a new chapter, one where my worth wasn't dependent on his approval or disapproval. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that someone had repaired my damaged mailbox. A note was attached. Mr. Taylor, heard about what happened. No one should have their property vandalized, especially not by family. Hope this helps. Your neighbors on Elm Street. The simple gesture of community support touched me more deeply than Blake's expensive gifts ever had. These were people who understood that neighborhoods were built on mutual respect and genuine care for one another, values that couldn't be purchased or inherited, only earned through consistent decency. 6 months later, as spring returned to Portland and I put the finishing touches on my work as consulting engineer for the new children's wing at Oregon Health Science University, I received a letter that I had been both expecting and dreading. It was from Blake. Dad, it began. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that losing everything, my job, my marriage, my relationship with Harrison, and most importantly, your respect, has forced me to confront who I had become. The letter went on to describe the past 6 months of his life, the divorce from Sienna, who had quickly found a new wealthy boyfriend to support her lifestyle, the criminal trial for embezzlement, which had resulted in 2 years of probation and full restitution. The struggle to find new employment after word of his theft had spread through Portland's business community. "I'm working now as a junior engineer for a small firm in Salem," he wrote. "The pay is a fraction of what I was making at Harrison's company, but it's honest work, and I'm remembering what it feels like to earn something through effort rather than manipulation. I know I destroyed our relationship through my own choices, my own greed, my own cruelty. I don't expect forgiveness, and I certainly don't expect things to go back to how they were. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you tried to teach me all those years, that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account or his possessions, but by his character and his contributions to the world." The letter concluded with an invitation. "If you're ever willing, I'd like to take you to lunch. Not at some expensive restaurant designed to impress, but at that diner near your house where we used to go when I was in high school. I'd like to hear about your work, your life, your happiness. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, you might be willing to tell me how to start rebuilding the kind of man you always hoped I would become." I set the letter down and looked out my kitchen window at the neighborhood where I had raised Blake, where neighbors had repaired my mailbox without being asked, where genuine community still existed among people who understood the value of simple decency. The choice was mine. Hold on to justified anger or offer the possibility of redemption to a son who seemed to have finally learned the lessons it had taken him 32 years to understand. I picked up the phone and dialed the number Blake had included at the bottom of his letter. "Blake? It's Dad. About that lunch invitation. I'd like that very much. But let's make it dinner. I'll cook. And Blake? Bring your appetite and your honesty. Those are the only 2 things you need to be welcome at my table." As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was perhaps the most important construction project I had ever undertaken. Not building a bridge or a hospital or an office tower, but rebuilding the relationship with my son on a foundation of genuine honesty rather than obligation or manipulation. Some structures, when they collapse, create space for something better to be built in their place. Sometimes, the most important thing you can build is a second chance. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone, even someone who has deeply hurt you, is the opportunity to prove they're capable of becoming better than they were. That evening, as I prepared dinner for 2 and set the table with my wife's best china, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. Blake's cruel rejection had seemed like the end of our relationship, but it had actually been the catalyst for both of us to discover who we really were beneath the roles we had been playing. When Blake arrived, he looked different, thinner, older, wearing clothes that were clean but inexpensive. Most importantly, he looked genuinely humbled rather than performing humility for effect. "Dad," he said simply, "thank you for giving me this chance." As we sat down to dinner in my modest dining room, surrounded by the authentic memories and simple decorations that he had once dismissed as embarrassing, I saw something in Blake's eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Genuine respect and appreciation for the man who had raised him. "So," I said, serving the pot roast I had learned to make during those long years when his mother was too sick to cook, "tell me about this honest work you've been doing. And Blake, tell me the truth. All of it. We're starting over, and this time we're building on solid ground." The conversation that followed lasted until well past midnight, filled with honesty, accountability, and the tentative beginnings of genuine reconciliation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Some damage takes years to fully repair, but it was something more valuable, a real beginning based on authentic foundations rather than convenient illusions. As Blake helped me clear the dishes, working together in comfortable silence for the first time in years, I realized that Harrison had been right about something important. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we were born with, but the one we choose to become through commitment to shared values and mutual respect. Tonight, my son and I had chosen each other again, not because blood demanded it, not because society expected it, but because we had finally learned to value the same things: honesty, integrity, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful that's designed to last. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the wealth, status, and inherited privilege in the world. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between family loyalty and personal integrity? How did you handle it? Your stories and experiences help build this community of people who believe that character matters more than wealth. The most important things you build in life aren't made of steel and concrete, but of love, respect, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Until next time, keep building something meaningful with your life.